First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Doug Shaw. And real quick, I guess I'm the Agriculture and Rural Texas Ombudsman for the Texas Water Development Board. This is a new role. One of our new board, I'm going to talk a little bit about some agency changes and things that have happened, but last fall we had 3 new board members come and take over our agency or as the governing body. Previously we'd been a 6-member voluntary board, and some legislation that went through last session, I'll talk about that too, kind of changed that. And so in August we had 3 new board members come in. One of the first things they did was they wanted to create a role position within the agency that their sole purpose was to work with folks in the agriculture industry and in rural Texas. I'd been with the board, give a little bit of background on myself, and most of you I talked with before this, but so maybe you heard this a second ago. But I grew up on a dairy in Godley, Texas, which is in Johnson County, just up north of here. I went to Tarleton State University in Stephenville, got my bachelor's and master's degree in agriculture economics. When I finished my master's degree, I went down to Austin, started working with the Texas Water Development Board. First 4 or 5 years I was there, I worked primarily with irrigation, livestock water use. The last several years I worked in regional water planning, primarily in West Texas, worked with regions A, O, B, and F, which is basically everything from Wichita Falls down to San Angelo, Sonora, Pecos, all the way up to the top of the Panhandle. So basically I worked in the northwestern third of the state. So I dealt with a lot of rural Texas. Of course, out in that part of up in the high plains, up in the Panhandle, irrigated agriculture is the primary water user, and as a matter of fact, one of the most intense water users in the state of Texas. And you talked a little bit, they're going to get off track here, but you talked a little bit about groundwater and the rural benefits and all that. Well, up that part of the world, it's all groundwater. There is no surface water. The Ogallala Aquifer pretty much provides 99.9% of the water. And so some of the things you'll see in the planning process is I've heard folks talking about communities, because it's the big user up there is around Lubbock would be cotton, up north would be corn. You hear folks talking about, well, would it be possible for a community who has their production wells near an irrigation well to lease or purchase or pay those producers to actually quit irrigating, for a certain amount of time, for extended amount of time, to keep the aquifer from drawing down around there. This is some things I've been talked about. I just thought about that as I was listening to Mike, and I just want to bring that up. I'll talk a little bit more about all that in a second. I just wanted to give myself a brief introduction of myself. You see, I don't know if y'all can see it, put a little Godly City Limits sign up there. I'm proud of where I'm from. So my role is the Rural Texas Ombudsman. Outreach in rural parts of the state. We heard over and over again in the last several years, and as I was traveling around regional water planning, when they're talking about SWIFT and all this money, giving this money to the Water Development Board for funding projects, you heard over and over again that all this money is going to go to Dallas. It's all going to go to Houston. Rural Texas just doesn't really have a voice. So, my job is to go out there and listen to these folks, but, it says outreach. I read something last summer that referred to the Water Development Board as an obscure agency. And, there's a lot of folks in the state that don't know what the Texas Water Development Board does. They don't even know that we exist. So I'm out there just meeting with folks, just like meetings like this. I've met with folks like Texas Rural Water Authority. I've been to several AgriLife events. Went to an event last week in Southeast Texas put on by Association of Rural Communities in Texas. Talking to city managers, county officials, basically just trying to get out the word of what it is we do. Because unlike TCEQ, I know some TCEQ kind of gets a bad rap sometimes. We aren't a regulatory agency. We're here to provide resources. Be it funding, be it planning, be it technical expertise. The Water Development Board is here to provide resources to help folks. And I tell people over and over again, it's rural areas that could really benefit from what we do the most, because the big cities, huge water providers, they have funding, they have people on staff that do a lot of this work. These small communities are the ones that really kind of benefit from what we can do. ensuring that the concerns of ag industry in rural Texas reach our board. Again, we've always had people out in the state, be it through the planning process or folks going out to look at some of the projects we fund. But you know, if we heard something concerning, you know, if we met with a small community and they had a problem with one of our loan programs or had some difficulty dealing with us, you know, a lot of times that message would get filtered as it funneled its way up the top before it got to our board members. Well, you know, if I hear something, one of the unique aspects of my position is if I hear something that's concerning when I'm out, you know, meeting with folks, you know, I go right back to the office, I knock on our board member's door and say, look, I heard this and it's quite concerning. So that's another one of the purposes of my role. Point of contact, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of big cities, a lot of large water providers, big districts, they have, you know, engineers on the books, or they work with engineers that regularly come and deal with the board. A lot of small communities don't have that resource. You know, I go back in Godly, where I grew up. When I was a kid, we had a city manager and that was about it. You know, if they were looking to fund a project and come to us for funding, you know, he wouldn't have known where to go. He wouldn't have known who to talk to, where to start. And a lot of times it's kind of overwhelming, especially if you come down to Austin. You know, if you're from a small community, especially out in West Texas, don't come into the big cities very often. You come into Austin for a meeting, you're frustrated before you ever get there because you're trying to find a place to park. It's just kind of overwhelming being just surrounded by so many buildings and people. And so I kind of work as a point of contact. I'm the guy that if you're with a small community, really anybody in the state, if you need something from the board, you know, give me a call, and you're not going to have to go through 15 different people before you talk to the person you need to. If I can't help you, I'm going to put you directly in contact with the person who can. And to help engage rural entities in the planning process, I'm going to talk a little about water planning in Texas, you know, how that works, how to get involved. And, you know, I'll throw up some numbers in a second, and it's really quite surprising to some people how few people really are get involved in this process. So it's another thing. I'm out there trying to encourage people. It's like these water plans, this process is really only as good as the people we can get involved in it. The more people we can get involved, the better. I mean, obviously, the more local information, the better the process is going to be. So a real quick outline about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a brief history of the Texas Water Development Board. Won't spend too much time on that, just to give you some background, let you know what it is we do, where we came from. I'm going to talk about SWIFT. Of course, that's been, if you pay attention to the papers at all, that's been in the news quite a bit really about the last year. So I'm going to talk about the SWIFT, talk about what's in the legislation, what the legislation that created SWIFT, what it all means. I'm going to talk about what we're doing to support that legislation, because it's not just did that legislation create SWIFT, it also made some changes in our agency. And then I'm going to talk about what the SWIFT will fund, which the SWIFT was created specifically to fund projects in the regional and state water plans. You know, the Water Development Board, and I'll mention this in a second, has always been able to fund projects, water projects, but this money is set aside specifically to fund projects that go through that planning process and are developed through that local input. And also project prioritization is part of that regional water planning process. That's something new that came out of the legislation. I'm going to talk a little bit about groundwater in Texas, the groundwater management area process, joint groundwater planning. Some of you guys may be familiar with that process. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Touch briefly on some specifics around here, and really just kind of an overview. And then what the Twdb can do for you now. So real quick, and as he said, if y'all have any questions, just feel free to stop me at any time. Let me know. I want this to be more of a discussion. I want you guys to get out of this what you want out of this. So in the early 1950s, well, for one thing, basically the history of the Water Development Board can be traced to legislative response to drought in Texas. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, you have what's considered the drought of record in Texas. In response to that, in 1957, the legislature created the Texas Water Development Board with two main purposes: to act as kind of a bank to fund water projects around the state and to undertake long-term water planning for the state. Under this process, of water planning. The Texas Water Development Board created 6 state water plans, 1961 being the first, and 1997. And that was a kind of a top-down process. I want to talk a little bit about that in a second. In the 1990s, there was another pretty serious drought, quite a bit of economic losses, mostly in agriculture. And what we found, just going to put all this up, there were a lot of folks around the state that are reporting they were getting real close to running out of water. And then what the legislature found was a lot of folks just weren't even aware that there was a water planning process. There were plans on the shelf in Austin, identifying areas that could potentially be affected should drought hit again, and pointing out ways to develop strategies to have excess water where when that hit, you didn't have to worry about running out of water. And so because so many of these people around the state weren't aware of this process, in 1997 the legislature passed Senate Bill 1, which created regional water planning. And I'll talk quite a bit about that in a second. Under that regional water planning process, we've created 3 state water plans, and we're in the process of creating the 4th. 2013, in response to the current drought, you have SWIFT. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that real quick. Basically, what's in the legislation. The SWIFT was created by HB 4, Senate Joint Resolution 1, and HB 1025. When I was following this, last session was the first session that I really closely followed, anything that was going through the legislature. And I learned real quick, I do not envy those guys in the Capitol, and I don't know how they keep their mind wrapped around half the legislation that's going on, because it's just so much going on. But basically, House Bill 4 did several things. We're going to put all this up. House Bill 4 provided TWDB governance change. So I mentioned earlier, previously we'd been a 6-member voluntary board. You had board members from all over the state. They'd basically come into Austin about once a month, get briefed up by staff, take action on items. They, depending on the member, some of them were really engaged in the process. Some of them, these guys had other full-time jobs. It wasn't their job to pay attention to this stuff full-time. So the legislature kind of felt that, with this additional money to be provided to the TWDB for funding projects, they wanted a more hands-on, full-time governing board. Folks that their sole job was to manage the Water Development Board, manage what it was we did to make sure this was all working correctly. It created an advisory committee to oversee. The SWIFT Advisory Committee is made up of 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and the comptroller or their designee. They're having their first meeting, I think, is next Monday to discuss the stuff, the SWIFT and SWERF. It created the SWIFT and the SWERF. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Just kind of outline what it is, what those 2 funds were, how they would operate. I'm not going to get real into specifics because honestly, I've sat and listened to some of our financial people talk to me about how that's going to work, and most of them are right over my head. You talk about issuing bonds and all that stuff, that's a little bit difficult for me. Define how the funds can be used, define the prioritization process, and outline technical aspects of the legislation. HB 1025, so really a way to think of it, HB 4 was the meat of the legislation. It was the really big, thick bill. HB 1025 basically just said, we want to take $2 billion, should HB 4 get approved, we want to take $2 billion out of the rainy day fund and put it in the SWIFT upon the passage of Senate Joint Resolution 1. Because there had been a lot of talk about how much money this would go. And keep in mind that $2 billion, it was cash basically given to the Water Development Board, but the idea was it's going to fund a revolving loan program. And basically, more or less, it would be used to buy down the percentage rates. So we could offer a cheaper rate, interest rate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But SJR 1, so the Senate and the House got together, started talking about this stuff, and they thought, this is a pretty big deal. It's kind of controversial taking money out of the rainy day fund. So they wanted to let the voters decide. So SJR 1 actually provided for the constitutional amendment. It was Proposition 6 last November on the ballot. It passed by like 70%. There's also some language in SJR 1 talk about SWIFT, and just for reference, SWIFT is State Water Implementation Fund for Texas. SWIRT is State Water Implementation Revenue Fund for Texas, I believe, and funding the State Water Plan, and it provided basic framework. And the passage allowed, so I guess last November when Prop 6 passed, $2 billion was the next day basically, $2 billion was transferred from the rainy day fund into the water development boards. We immediately put that in an interest-bearing account. It's been sitting there gaining interest since November. Like I said, ideally, keep in mind that we do offer some grants, and I want to talk about a little bit more about some of our other programs. SWIFT is completely loan money, so it may not be real interesting for a lot of ag industries. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those folks that may use that money, but it's going to be a very low interest rate. Actually, I think I have some of that. So this all came out of HB4. At least 20% of SWIFT will be used to fund conservation or reuse projects. This was actually over and over. You heard the legislature saying things like the cheapest, most efficient new source of water would be conserving the water we already have, stretching that out. So they want to make sure, and this is a floor, not a ceiling, at least 20%, could be way more than that, of the money we spend on an annual basis out of SWIFT go to fund conservation projects. And then at least 10% would go to serve rural communities or farmers in Texas. Now the idea, and you threw up numbers earlier about 90% of Texans live in urban areas, but 93% of the land is rural. Well, and that's about right. I spoke with some folks at Texas Rural Water Association, and they were a real big proponent of this 10%. And basically, about 10 to 15% of customers or people in Texas purchase their water from, or are on private wells, or purchase their water from communities or water providers that would be considered rural. So the idea was at least 10% of the money spent should go to fund rural projects. I will say it's the rural, the small entities that really benefit from our projects or from our programs, not just the SWIFT, but from our other programs as well. It's the big cities. So we're basically loaning money. We have the full faith and credit of the state of Texas. We're AAA rated. We get the best rates. The SWIFT will allow us to buy down that rate. About 50% of the rate we get, we can offer to our customers. That's really attractive, but a lot of the bigger cities think, we're already AAA rated. We can get good, cheap money. We don't want to deal with the Water Development Board. They require maybe an environmental review for this program or something that we wouldn't have to fund otherwise. But the rural communities, our programs are really attractive to them, because a lot of times those small communities don't have the ability to go out and get cheap money on the open market, and to get it at half of the interest rate we're getting it at. That's actually pretty low. And I could I should have. I can put up numbers and show that we can save quite a bit of money over the life of the loan. Real quick, let me talk about the farming. The idea was, we talked about groundwater in the Panhandle and how the majority of that's used for irrigation. And those folks up there are very, very attuned to the problem, or to the issue, because as more and more private land is using that irrigation, or using that water for irrigation purposes, the folks up there are starting to pay attention, because the water table is starting to draw down. Wells starting to go dry, especially a lot of smaller communities. So the idea was, we've worked with a lot of those groundwater districts up there in the Panhandle, and ideally the way the SWIFT, because we can only loan money to political subdivisions of the state of Texas, so we can loan money to a groundwater district, for example. Historically, the Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District, which is northeast of Amarillo, they've used some of our programs in the past where they've come in. They take out a loan from us at a fairly low rate. Sometimes they're getting 1% interest rate, and they turn around and loan that money to their producers, for their producers to go out and purchase, to convert maybe from furrow irrigation to center pivot to to LIPA or to a drip system that's much more efficient. That way the producers are still irrigating, still making money, still getting the yield off their land, but they're doing it with less water, which leaves more water available for the city customers, more or less. And so we see things like that really as being where that money is going to go out to help farmers in the state. So real quick, agency changes. I mentioned our change of our board. One of the first things they did, they came in and reorganized the agency. Historically, if you came into the board for funding, you're going to talk. If you come into the board 5 times over 5 years, you could be working with 5 different people. So they reorganized the agency into these teams. So if you're with the same community, if the city of Gatesville, for example, wanted to come to the board for funding, every time they come into the board, they're going to be dealing with the same people. And those people are going to be working with people in this area. I'll throw up a map real quick. The idea is, and I mentioned this somewhat earlier, you go to different parts of the state. Texas is so big, it's so geographically different. It's very different dealing with someone in East Texas versus West Texas versus Panhandle versus South Texas. So the idea is you get to know the people in the area, you get to know the area, you get to know water issues in the area, and it just makes the customer service that much better. You get to know these folks. It just makes everything about the process easier. The different colored areas are the regional water planning groups, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. The black lines are the teams. So you guys would be in this team 2. Of course, most of this is in region G, which would be region B and region G. So only 2 regions, and they like the West Texas region is 4 regions. Ideally, it's because of the number of communities. Obviously, as you get east, you go further east in Texas, the communities get closer and closer together, and you get more and more of them. And so the idea was they're going to have more projects per area. So out in West Texas, everything's so spread out. You just don't get a whole lot of. We do a lot of business out there, but there's just not a whole lot of communities. They also provide more emphasis on outreach, including they created my position. Again, we're really working. We're going out. We're doing a lot more speaking. We're attending a lot more public meetings. Just trying to get out there and visit with folks, let folks know what it is we do. And we've created a public rulemaking process. In case y'all are curious, that's my hometown of Godley, Texas. Those the 2 restaurants I was talking about earlier. There's one over there and one over here. They created a very public rulemaking process. Put all this up. The HB4 said that rules would be in place for SWIFT, how SWIFT would operate by March of next year. Our board did not want to go into the next legislative session with open rules. They want to have those rules adopted by this December. But the ideal, generally when state agencies, legislation's passed, you have statute, rules are basically how those statutes get enacted and further expand upon that statute. Most of the time, agencies will write rules, they'll release drafts, and then they'll get hammered saying, you didn't take enough public comment, this is wrong, we want this. So our board, they really wanted to get as much input up front as possible before developing the draft rules. They had 4 work sessions. The 4th one's tomorrow. This is the first time our board has ever gone out, and this is our full board. They've gone out. They were in Conroe, they were in Lubbock, Harlingen, and then tomorrow they're in El Paso, going out and basically having board meetings in these places. And the purpose of these meetings is to give the public an opportunity to speak to our board without having to go to Austin to do so. We've also had these stakeholder meetings where we've identified about 200 to 300 stakeholders from around the state, and then also there were public meetings as well. These were staff-led in Austin, basically 3-4-hour meetings where we were just taking public comment, public input, and we had staff there taking all this down on what the public thought should be included in these rules. Summer of 2014, I think June 23rd, somewhere around there, we should have the draft rules out. I think the June 26th is our board meeting where they'll be discussing that there in Austin. And so the draft rules will come out this summer. That'll go through the public comment period, and then the idea is December of this year to adopt the final rules. And so I put this up there. We're obviously taking written comments on how this will operate and on the rules, I mean, all the time. So I encourage any of you that have any interest at all to, take part in that process. So what will the SWIFT fund? Like I said earlier, it was created to support projects in the state water plan. Just a real quick, I mentioned that 20% to fund conservation project. About a third of the projects in the current state water plan identify conservation as a way to meet future shortages. About 30% is new supply development, and new supply development would be anything from building a new reservoir, developing new groundwater sources, and then also other surface water. And these other surface water strategies are more or less, some of it's voluntary transfers of water rights, but a lot of that is there are parts in the state, especially in the eastern part of the state, where you have reservoirs, lakes built. The infrastructure isn't there to move the water to folks, to the people it needs. So those projects are just developing the infrastructure to move water from existing lake to communities. Like I said, I just wanted to put this up there real quick. State water planning, as I mentioned earlier, 6 water plans under the state water planning process from 1961 to 1997. This was a top-down process. Basically, you had some engineers, some economists sitting in Austin, identifying water supplies, water demands around the state, and developing strategies to meet those future shortages. And like I said, these well-intended plans, a lot of really good information, but for the most part, these plans sit on the shelf and gather dust for decades. So regional water planning was created, and those are the we had 3 state water plans under this process, and this is a regional process. Every 5 years, you have a regional water plan. The next year, that turns into the state water plan. So, for example, the current 2012 state water plan is a compilation of 2011 regional water plans. So, how does a regional water plan get developed? Again, there are the regions of the state. Senate Bill 1 passed in 1997, created regional water planning, and it said that there will be these statutory interest groups will be represented on these planning groups. The public would just be anybody from the public, counties or county commissioners, county judges, municipalities, anybody from, we have mayors, city managers, directors of water utilities for cities, industries are represented, agriculture, depending on where you are in the state. Up in the Panhandle, we have, in Region A, I know there's a sorghum and a corn producer on the group. Region O, there's several cotton producers on the group. There's also some cattle raisers. Region B, there's a gentleman from the Wagner Ranch on the planning group. So, depending on where you are in the state is what type of agriculture is represented. Also, the environmental interests, small business, water district, groundwater districts, water utilities, river authorities. In 2011, legislation was passed to put a groundwater management area representative on each regional water planning group. That's the new statutory interest. They're appointed by the groundwater management area. I'm going to talk a little bit about that process after we go through this here, but that's also a very important process, and I'm sure some of you are very aware of that process. So what is regional water planning? Basically, it's state funded. The state of Texas, we're given money every biennium to fund this process. We can only give loan or grant money to political subdivisions of the state of Texas. So you have to have a political subdivision step up and represent each planning group. For example, here in Region G, the Brazos River Authority out of Waco represents the region. They do all the administrative work. They host the meetings. They post notice, do all that type of stuff, maintain the website. But basically, we give the money to the political subdivision, and they can only, it's not just their money to spend. The planning group has to approve how they spend that money. But they go out and they post notice. They hire a consulting firm to work with the Water Development Board and the planning group. They project future population and water demand. Obviously the municipal demand is going to be driven by population, which is based on census. The state data center projects that out on the county level. Water Development Board takes that, breaks it down to a more like a what we call a water user group, which would be a city or a water district or a municipal water authority. Project their population out 50 years. Basically, apply a GPCD. Usually, it's an average, depending on what's been requested. It's a dry year GPCD, gallons per capita per day for said community, or an average of the last several years. Apply that to population. That's where the municipal water demands come from. We also identify demands for agriculture, which includes irrigation, includes livestock. We identify mining water demands, which would include oil and gas water use, which has been quite expanded in some parts of the state. You know, up where I grew up in Johnson County, you know, annual water use just more than doubled during the last decade because of the oil and gas activity. Of course, it's come back down as the price of gas has gone down and folks have gone looking for oil and out in West Texas and South Texas. But you know, that's another thing that's identified. That water use is identified. Basically, every drop of water that's really used in the state of Texas, they go out and identify that water, project it out 50 years. Then they identify existing supplies. And this is for surface water. They're required to use the water availability models from TCEQ, which are the models that are used for permitting. For groundwater, this is the first the 2016 regional water plans will be the first time that they use numbers that came out of the groundwater management area process. So some of you guys are familiar with the desired future conditions, that process. This is the first time that those numbers coming out of that process are really working as kind of a limiting factor in groundwater availability in the planning process. Now, granted, there may be way more groundwater available than what is shown by those numbers. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But that's what they have to use as kind of a cap in planning. And this could be limiting. You know, it could really limit a community's eligibility from our funds if, you know, they want to go out and drill groundwater somewhere where it's above and beyond what the modeled available groundwater is, so they wouldn't be eligible for our funding. But you know, it's up to the local districts whether or not they're going to provide permits anyway. They also identify surpluses or needs. So anywhere where there's a shortage identified in the future, even if that shortage identified in 2060, they have to go through the process of identifying a way to meet that shortage. In other words, to keep from running out of water. These water management strategies. These are the projects that you hear about, the projects that are eligible for SWIFT funding. That's what we're talking about, these strategies for meeting future water needs. And also they can make policy recommendations. These policy recommendations can be very detailed, very aimed at the Water Development Board, aimed at TCEQ, Texas Department of Agriculture. It can be aimed at anyone. They can be general policy recommendations. It's just a place for the planning group, you know, to state, you know, publicly something that they feel strongly about. Real quick, water management strategies. You know, there are several types. Like I said, these are how we're going to meet our future water needs. There are projects or actions recommended to meet needs. Conservation, wastewater reuse is one we're seeing more and more of. I don't know if you guys are aware, the city of Big Spring, Colorado River Municipal Water District, which provides water to most folks in West Texas, they just opened up a water reuse facility in Big Spring where they're basically taking their wastewater, treating it to a very high level, blending it back with their lake water, and then sending it on to the treatment plant. And honestly, I've been out there. Their water, it's funny, the water coming out of that reuse plant is actually cleaner than the water in the lakes because they have such a high salinity. I mean, a lot of TDS in the surface water out there. And I've drank a glass of water right out of that plant. But I know that's you hear Brownwood's talking about doing one of these facilities. Wichita Falls is looking at an emergency reuse project right now, and they have long-term one. You're seeing more and more and more of this wastewater reuse. And a lot of it's not just for potable. You also have a lot of wastewater reuse for irrigating like city parks, you know, city and county lands. And you're seeing a lot of that in these projects as well. Desalination of surface and groundwater. Out in West Texas, you hear a lot about desalination of brackish water. Other parts of the state you're hearing more and more of that as well, especially as water gets more and more scarce in some areas. They're seeing this, what in the past had been economically unfeasible. They're really starting to look at this, although it is more expensive than your traditional treatment. New infrastructure to access existing supplies, I talked about that earlier, and new water diversions. You're not seeing a lot of new reservoirs. You know, Texas went through its reservoir building stage, you know, several decades ago. I think we've kind of slowed that down. There's still, you know, a dozen or so reservoirs identified in the regional water plans, mostly in the eastern portion of the state. One interesting one is an off-channel reservoir. I don't know if you are familiar with LCRA. You know, they provide water to rice farmers down in the south end of that basin. You know, this is the third year in a row that rice farmers haven't had water delivered to them because of the Highland Lakes are, you know, not doing well. And so they're talking about building an off-channel reservoir. So not damming up the river, but actually going off, buying some property, you know, basically building like a 100-acre ring dike structure where then when they have excess flows in the Colorado River, just pump that over. Like all this rain we've gotten in Austin right now. Everything that falls in Austin, there's really nothing downstream to catch that water. It just ends up flowing down the Colorado into the Gulf. And so when we have excess flows like this, they could pump that over, and it would be available down in South Texas where you have higher humidity, so you're not losing as much evaporation. The soils, you're not leaving, it's closer, so you're not losing it and transfer to evaporation as well. Yes, sir.
The excess flows, is that a pretty significant amount?
It can be. They're looking at being able to provide an extra 100,000 acre feet a year to their system by this off-channel reservoir. So yeah, you know, in an ideal year, what would happen is, you know, if the lakes were full, then they would release water down to fill that off-channel up, depending on the levels of the lake. You know, but in times like right now, where the lakes are low, but you get a lot of rain and below the lakes in the basin, you still get a lot of flow in the river you'd be able to pump over and put it and store it and catch that water instead of it just running down the river into the bay. And so that's actually, you know, and it would be a source of water, you know, had they had that in place, that would at least been some water for rice farmers. Of course, you know, with the rice farmers not even getting water delivered as they flood the rice, that's just the tradition. You know, they're not planting anything. And I've explained to people, it's like, you know, when those guys, you know, regardless of how you feel about it, when they don't get their water, that's like, you know, you getting laid off. I mean, it's just, they're not producing that year. So, throw up every strategy, and all these water management strategies are identified for the following factors. Every strategy is analyzed for how it will affect water quality. And this is will this affect surface water quality? Will this affect the groundwater quality? You know, depending on the type of project, they have to go through this. And like I said, every project is analyzed for these things. Existing water rights. You know, is this project going to affect someone else's water rights? Is it going to shorten, or is it going to cause someone else not to be able to access their full water rights if this project's developed? In-stream flows, which basically, you know, the amount of flows in the creeks into the rivers. You know, is this project going to have a big impact on flows? You know, groundwater projects, some of them, depending on where the wells are located, it could have a big effect. You know, if it's an alluvium type project, you know, it could have a big effect on in-stream flows. Bay and estuary freshwater flows, obviously, you know, you have what we can call environmental flows. You have a certain amount that has to be released, you know, to make sure that the bays and estuaries of the state, you know, maintain their health. That's another thing that they have to be analyzed for. Sustainable aquifer yield. And of course now, because of the GMA process, this isn't quite as important as it was in the past, because it kind of goes through they go through that analyzation and that process. But, you know, historically, you don't want a project, you know, you wouldn't want to recommend a project that, yeah, we can put in a well filled here and it can produce for 5 years. You know, they want to look at the long-term sustainability. Is there water there to provide water to this community for an ongoing amount of time? Does this aquifer recharge? If it doesn't recharge, you know, how long is this sustainable? Agriculture water resources. So will this project affect, you know, the availability of water for agriculture? Threatened and endangered species. You know, how will these projects just sometimes not necessarily the impact of water, taking water out of the ground, but if you are going to build a reservoir, what does this do? Is this endangering a habitat of an endangered or threatened species? I mean, I know right now you're dealing with a lot of this. I don't know if you're familiar with the lesser prairie chicken. It's been all over the news up in West Texas, the Panhandle area. So they have to be very sensitive to that. Even though they're drilling groundwater, if they're moving, pipelines, where they're running those pipelines has to be very sensitive to that. Just general wildlife habitat. How does this project affect wildlife habitat, public lands, and then also recreation? How do these projects affect those things?
Doug, one quick question.
Yes, sir.
Threatened and endangered species. To what level? What importance is that that particular topic in determining what projects might get funded and might not?
Well,
does it take a high level because it's such a
Well, keep in mind that it's really up to the planning group. And one thing to also keep in mind is that we in the Water Development Board, we have this money to fund projects, but talking about projects getting funded, it's up to the entity that would actually build the project. It's the Water Development Board doesn't come out and say, okay, here, you go build this project. It's you got to come to us, say, hey, we have this project. It's in the regional water plan. We'd like to implement this. We'd like to, seek some funding for that. But as far as your question, that goes back to the planning group. Does the regional planning group, do they put a high value on that, or do they put a low value on that? They have to evaluate every project for how it would affect, for example, endangered species. But if the planning group doesn't feel strongly, then they can go in and recommend that strategy anyway. If the planning group, if they see it has an impact and the planning group feels strongly about protecting a certain species, then they may not recommend that strategy. They may leave it as an alternate strategy and recommend something else in its place.
So it's variable. I didn't know if maybe just the federal government.
No, it's not. Obviously that they're going to have to take into consideration if something's on one of those federally protected lists, then they're going to have to evaluate how that project might affect that species. But it's up to the planning group whether or not they want to say, yeah, it has a high impact, but we want to recommend the project anyway. Or it has a high impact, but this is the only viable project to get water to these people. And you have a lot of that out in the western part of the state. So why do we plan? There are several reasons. Water right permits from TCEQ for a new project must be consistent with the regional and state water plan. Financial assistance, this is prior to SWIFT. Like I said, we've always had these projects, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these programs later. But every one of our programs didn't necessarily require that be a project that was developed through that process, but that it be consistent. And what consistent means is we just want to see that the source is consistent. For example, the city of Gatesville wanted to come to the board, prior to SWIFT for funding. The project they wanted to implement wasn't in the regional water plan, but it was the same source of groundwater, for example. Then that would be fine. That would be consistent. Now, if the city of Gatesville only had, groundwater identified as a source, but they wanted to come over here and purchase water, from this lake over here, that wouldn't be consistent. Which, there's still a way to get that money. We can issue waivers, but it has to go through a process. The planning group has to, weigh in on it and say, yeah, we think that's a reasonable thing to do. And it's just more process, and it lengthens the amount of time before you can get that money in your hand. And that's just another reason why it's important to pay attention to the regional water planning process. Benefits of planning, public and planning member education. The more all of us know, the better off we all are. If you go to these meetings, even if you're not a planning group member, you're going to get educated. You're going to learn not just about your specific community, but about water resources in your general area, in the region. And the more educated you all are, the better off everybody that you would provide information to is development of regional partnerships, and just not necessarily connecting systems, but meeting other people in the water industry. You may be dealing with something that someone 4 or 5 counties over dealt with 5 years ago, and this is just a forum to make these kind of relationships and kind of talk about these things. It's a lot easier to deal with something after you've talked to someone else who's dealt with a very similar situation. And then it's the better data for water planning. You know, like I said earlier, the more local input we get, the better this process is. So, I want to go back real quick, and this is Region G. I'm going to go through some specifics for Region G. As you can see, we're in kind of in the middle of Region G, right smack dab in the middle of it, kind of towards the lower end of it. It's a big region. It's actually the largest region of the 16. Well, it's the largest number of counties. I believe Region F, just to the west, is larger space-wise, but some of the counties are bigger. Like I said, I grew up, until I moved to Austin, spent my entire life right in the middle of Region G. The little numbers, these are the statutory interest groups, and these are the voting members on Region G, you know, and what they represent. Just kind of so you can see a dispersion of where these guys are. You know, you don't really see any from Coryell County, but several from some of the surrounding counties. And I would like to point out that these planning group, they get vacancies, you know, so often. These guys, it's not an appointed term or a lifetime term. You know, they usually serve, I think, 4 or 5 year terms. And so it's really important, if you want to be involved, go to these meetings. If you'd like to, yourself or someone else, you think you know someone else that you think would be beneficial to be a member of these planning groups, then, you know, watch for vacancies. The Brazos River Authority hosts the website. I'll put the website up in a second, or the link to it, and they'll post notice whenever they have vacancies coming up. Some quick, like I said, so Region G, you know, they go through several times in the process, going through the process of identifying water supplies, water demands, water needs. They like to survey all the entities in the state. So in Region G, there are 235 water user groups. So a water user group is any city over 500 people, any water provider, municipal water authority, water service corporation, I think that has more than like 250 connections. So they've identified 235 of those in Region G. They sent out surveys to every one of them asking, you know, this is your draft population. You know, what do you think? Do you think this population looks right? Does it match up with, you know, your customers? Does this match up with your local projections? The demands, does that look right? Are the sources of supply, are they correct? You know, is this right? Are these the permits you have, or is this the groundwater sources you have? Of those 235 entities that were surveyed, only 74 logged in and reviewed the data. 31 of them agreed with the data, 27 requested changes. So, you know, almost half of the ones that looked at it requested some kind of changes, which meant, you know, would in turn make the plan a better plan. But that's still an awful lot of folks that just didn't look at it. A lot of folks, you know, maybe they didn't know what these letters they got in the mail were. They didn't have time. Like I said, a lot of these communities are really small staffed. That's why I really encourage you, if you see something in the mail from Region G, and this is separate from, you know, the Water Development Board sends out a water use survey for entities, and that's required by law. This is something that's separate. This is going to help you long term, and maybe worth spending, you know, 30 minutes, an hour to sit down, look at these numbers, and kind of give some input. Because like I said, the more input they get from the local sources, the better. Another thing that they ask about is for projects, water management strategies. You know, they want to include the regional planning groups. They don't want to develop strategies for you. You know, if you're with the city of Gatesville, with the city of Belton, or wherever, you know, if you have plans, projects in the plans for your future, the planning groups want to include those in the regional water plans. They want to make sure whatever you're planning on building 10, 20 years from now, they include that so you're eligible for all of our funding. You know, they want to know what it is the locals are actually going to do, because we know those are the folks that are responsible for implementing these projects. So like I said, they did a second survey last fall talking about the water management strategy, stuff like that. I just wanted to show you this. I thought that was interesting. Next step, back up. Summer of 2014, so right now the planning groups are working on evaluating water management strategies. So now would be a time, if you're with a city, with a water provider, if you have something on, you know, water projects down the line that you'd like to be included, now would be the time to contact the planning group. I'll throw up some contact information in a second. Also, if you have any ideas, maybe you're not with the city, you're not with the, someone that actually provides water, but you have some ideas of types of projects that may be beneficial for the region, for an area, I would encourage you to contact folks at the planning group. The fall and winter, they'll be developing the draft 2016 regional water plan. Next summer, they'll deliver the draft of that to us. Next May, next November, the final regional water plan, so the 2016 regional water plan will be sent to the board next November, December. And then the entire year of 2016, the Texas Water Development Board will be developing this 2017 state water plan. So basically, the SWIFT money that I talked about earlier will probably be available next spring, the earliest, probably next May, sometime like that. So you'll have about a year where it's going to be funding projects in the 2012 state water plan. And then once the 2017 state water plan becomes adopted, then those are the projects that are eligible for that funding. And most of everything that hasn't been implemented from the 2012, if the communities, whatever, would like them, they're rolled over, and then it's got even more strategies. The 2017 plan is really, I think honestly, I've been with the board long enough that each of these plans has gotten better, and I think the 2017 plan is going to be, we've seen a lot more involvement, a lot more interest in the last year or so than we had in the past. So contact info, that's the Brazos G Water is the website for the Region G Planning Group. David Dunn is the engineer, the consulting engineer that works for Region G. The reason I put his name up there instead of the chairman or something like that, because he's the guy that actually doing the work for Region G. And so if you have any input on strategies, projects, he's the guy you need to call and talk to. And I really think that he's a top-notch. I really have a lot of respect for David. He's a good guy. He actually came out. If y'all, any of y'all, those of y'all that came down to Belton, David was there and spoke briefly. And like I said, he would love to hear from you. So
he has heard from us. He has heard from us.
Has he?
We haven't got much satisfaction.
Yeah. What's
We haven't got any answers since the last letter, have you, Judge?
what was the question?
Well, we were talking about our water needs over here in Cordell County and the Off Channel Reservoir, which is in the plans,
Yes, sir.
and we don't seem to be getting any answers back.
Okay.
And the unfortunate thing is the 235 you mentioned in Region G that had surveys sent out, one of our multi-county groundwater, which handles 3 counties, never even got the survey.
Yeah.
And it's been a real matter of contention.
Okay. I'll pass that info along, and that's why I'm here. I'm hear this stuff. I want to make sure that y'all are hearing. For the surveys, I will talk about. Those are usually water providers that they survey. But I think all the input they can get, the better, in my opinion.
And multi-county groundwater is the provider.
Okay. I'm sorry. Then yes, I'll put up my contact information at the end. And I really encourage you, send me anything you have. That way, I can work with folks at the board that work with that planning group. And I'll talk to some other folks. I know the chairman of Region G. He's a real nice gentleman from.
Now, Mr. Wilson and I have become real pen pals.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I will. I'm here to work on your behalf as well. So, if you want to include me on some of that, maybe I can give a little bit extra push to get you guys part of this.
There needs to be some better policy because I applied to be on that board 4 different times in 17 years. And I guess the last time was the closest I've got.
Uh-huh.
And when I walk in there and there's 2 people that's applying for a position and there's counties that's represented on the selection committee, that pretty well tells you that you're not going to be selected.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be some policy change on how these people serve on these boards.
Okay.
Because it's broken. It's the fox has the key to the chicken house.
I've
It only lets in who it wants to.
I've heard that. This is not the first time I've heard that.
I'm not complaining against Bell County, but they got 4 representatives on there.
Yeah. That's why I was looking at that map. There are some of the regions have term limits. So you can serve 1 term, 2 terms, and that's it. You know, I know some of the regions, it's the same folks serving that it was since 1997. So I'll definitely pass that along. But again, that's one of the things that we leave. You know, there was a lot of freedom, local freedom given to these planning groups when they wrote their bylaws as how they operate. But yeah, I can definitely pass that information along. And please, you know, send me anything.
We'll start including you on our stuff.
I would love that. I would love that. I mean, that's one more voice. Like I said, that's part of my position. Is I'm really here to advocate on the behalf of rural Texas. You know, so.
You speak of rural Texas, and I've asked and have never been given a definitive answer. What's your definition of rural Texas?
Well, you know, if you look, there's about 50 definitions of rural out there. So HB4 actually defined for rural projects. I think what they defined is 10,000 or less for a rural community. But then there's also some language, and don't quote me on this, you might want to look it up, but I think there's some language in HB4 that talks about if there's no community in a county over 50,000, then that might make some more communities eligible, but don't quote me on that. And again, this is one of the things why it's really important to pay attention to the rulemaking process, is because I know that 10,000 is pretty specific, but there's some other areas where we have some wiggle room, you know, in developing the rules. You know, one of the ideas is, because this is going to be, you know, we're going to solicit for these SWIFT funds, you know, probably a couple times annually, and it may be kind of competitive. You know, we may get 20 applications and may only be able to fund 15 projects. And so we're going to have to go through and rank those. And one of the things that we're going to have to rank is, you know, does it serve a diverse rural and urban population? You know, does this just serve urban? Does it just serve rural? And those interpretations of how we identify that, I think, is left up to us in our rules.
If I could ask 2 more questions.
No, go ahead, sir.
One, from the standpoint of prop money going into SWIFT, I think there's 10% of the total dollars are supposed to be earmarked for rural
Yes, sir.
projects.
Yes, sir.
But I also think I heard you say that the actual applications have to be submitted by the entity that actually is going to do the construction or the work. And in our case, does that equate to BRA?
No. So it would be, it's whoever, you know, if it's, you know, I keep using the city of Gatesville. You know, if they want to build a project, then they would be the ones applying for the funding.
Great.
And obviously, you know, you know, you even have like some partnerships where you have like several small communities, maybe a small community that has a water service corporation that serves a area right outside the city. They may be partnering on a project. You know, they could apply jointly. Just one of them could apply. It all depends on, you know, how it works out. And that's the same with some of our other programs as well. And like I said, I apologize that you guys haven't been, you know, happy with any input you've given so far, but please include me so I can be one more voice. That's part of my job. We talked about project prioritization. This kind of leads right into what we were just talking about. You've had these regional water plans, state water plans for a while. Had all these projects in them. They'd never been prioritized. The legislature wanted to basically see them. You know, how would each planning group rank these projects in number of importance? There was a lot of pushback from some of the regions. They didn't like the way this, you know, I've heard one gentleman out in West Texas say, you know, for whoever is going to be getting water from that project's the most important project in the world to them. You know, how do you say one's more important than another? But this all came out of the legislation, so you know you gotta follow the law. So the prioritization, the legislation pointed out these are the minimum criteria to be considered when prioritizing these projects. You had all 16 chairmen of the regional water planning groups. They got together and basically came with several questions for each one of these topics. Decade in which a project is needed. Obviously, the chairman felt that this was by far the most important thing. They gave like 60%, 50-60% of the weighting to this one criteria, because obviously a project that's needed in the current decade should rank higher than a project that's needed in 2050. that was their thinking. Feasibility. It was really kind of funny listening to them talk about the difference between feasibility, viability, and sustainability, because those were listed as three separate things in the legislation. But they developed something. Feasibility is all about really science. Is there a is this a feasible project? Is there a sponsor? Is someone going to step up and actually build this thing? Viability had to do with is the water actually there? Sustainability was like, is the water there long term? And then cost effectiveness, how much per acre foot, which sometimes in some areas of the state the only source of water is a lot more expensive than in other parts of the state. So, but that's just some of the things that came out of the legislation. Then these are the things that are going to be considered whenever the projects come into the Twdb for funding. That a lot of folks kind of don't like seeing that serve a large population, but I would like to point out, we do have that 10% that's set aside for rural, which helps for the small communities. Assist the diverse urban and rural population. Provide regionalization. A lot of parts of the state, we've actually funded studies in West Texas that shows that regionalization just isn't economical. The cities are so far apart. But in some parts of the state, it would be very, really benefit a lot of folks by not necessarily combining systems, but connecting systems. That way, in times of drought, once one community loses a source, you can get an emergency connection from somewhere else if it's already in place. Those kind of things are actually identified in the regional water plans. And then meet a high percentage of the water users' needs. That one really helps small communities too. A lot of, for example, Dallas. The city of Dallas has like 200 strategies in their current regional water plan. Each one meets a small amount of their water needs. Whereas a community the size of Gatesville may only have one project, and it meets all their needs. So that one project that meets a small community's entire needs is going to rank higher than a project that, for a big city that only meets some of their needs. So now let's talk about groundwater. Okay. So 60% of the total amount of water used in Texas in 1999, and it's about the same now, is from groundwater. Majority of that, 81% of the groundwater is used for irrigation. And again, I mentioned earlier that the cotton is the #1 water user in the state of Texas. You hear a lot about rice, you hear a lot about corn, but cotton is still the #1 water user in Texas. If you've ever spent any time around Lubbock, Texas, as far as I know, that's pretty much the largest cotton patch in the world. And you drive out around there in the fall when that cotton's in bloom, it's all you see, white, for miles and miles and miles. And the majority of that's irrigated with groundwater. And then up north of there is a lot of corn, a lot of sorghum, a lot of wheat up there as well, a lot of irrigation. The groundwater provides about 39% of water to cities. One thing I like to point out is that you're seeing more and more cities turn to groundwater, but like where I grew up, or my parents are on private wells. You got in rural Texas, most folks are on private wells, and as you're seeing more and more cities, larger cities look at groundwater, that in turn really affects those people on private wells, because a lot of these aquifers have been producing at steady rates for a long time. Then all of a sudden you come in and have a high production, a couple high production wells come in. It may cause some drawdown and really have a local effect. And that's one reason you have the groundwater management areas in place. I'm going to talk a little about that in a second. But that's just something I like to point out. And then obviously all the benefits you were talking about earlier for private land, and like you said, around San Antonio, you're hearing a lot of similar type projects. Talk about that in West Texas, like I mentioned earlier, where maybe paying to keep land non-production and non-irrigated, or to maybe convert irrigated land back to range land, back to to run cattle on, in order to purchase, and more or less buying water rights from farmers, to conserve the water for municipal use. You're hearing some of that talk. I don't know how realistic that is about getting implemented, but you put up the numbers. But most of Texas is private owned, and as you see land develop, I was joking with some guys up in Wichita Falls a while back, because they're all surface water. There's very little groundwater up there, and their lakes have seen, even in the last several years when they actually got some rain, their lakes have seen some of the lowest inflows ever. Like, I think 9 of the 10 lowest inflow years they've ever received are in the last decade. One gentleman joked, well, we could just pave all of Wichita County. That way everything runs off and we catch all the water in the lake. Well, they don't have groundwater formations up there, but in other parts of the state, when you start paving up and developing areas, that affects, the percolation of the water down into the ground, which would recharge the aquifers. You see in Austin, if you ever spent much time down in southwest Austin, you see all these Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone signs. And, I would venture a guess that the Edwards Aquifer recharges at a much lower rate than it used to in that part of just because of all the, they have designed things where it's going to, kind of channel water towards certain areas, but also the water that's recharging is carrying off a lot of the waste from the city as well. So there is a big impact of how the land is being utilized. Brush control, that's one thing I didn't really talk about. That's a project that's actually in some of the regional water plans as a source or a strategy to meet future needs. Because as many of you may know, mesquite, salt cedar has gotten out of control in a lot of the state. And that in turn affects, but depending on where it is, depending on the geology of the area, could affect runoff for surface water, could affect recharge and groundwater. I know, and I work with folks at the NRCS. They have their cost share program where they fund brush management, and one of their requirements is it actually be in the regional water plans. So that's just another way that, the private lands that is involved in this and that land management, because again, it's all about, when you're talking about aquifers and recharging, because up in the West Texas, the Ogallala up there doesn't really recharge, but a lot of the aquifers around here do. And the way the land is being managed, the way the cities are growing and developed, is going to have a long-term effect on the life of those aquifers. Just want to put up a map. Most of you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with this. The aquifers in Texas. These are the major aquifers in Texas. I guess the major aquifer is defined as an aquifer that covers a large area and produces a large amount of water. The minor aquifer is something that covers a small area and produces a large amount of water, or covers a large area and produces a small amount of water. But these are the major aquifers of Texas. Of course, you guys, as y'all know, are on the Trinity. The dark green area on the Trinity is basically where it outcrops, where it comes up to the surface. The stripe is the deeper part of the Trinity. I grew up right over there on the edge of where, our place where I grew up was right up here. And I will say, there's a creek that runs through my dad's place that I fished in my whole life growing up. In the 18 years that I lived there before I went to college, I never once saw that creek go dry. It was always had water. There was 2 spots on our place where the Trinity bubbled up and was spring fed that creek. Right about the time the drought kind of started is when you saw a big uptick in production out of the Trinity with the fracking and the Barnett Shale. And right after followed that is when the drought intensified. And that, I know for a fact that spring at my parents' place hasn't produced any water out of it in at least 6-7 years. And it's like I said, they're right there on the edge of the outcrop where it's deep, and that creek's been dry. And like I said, 18 years I lived there, never saw it dry. It's been dry for like 6 years straight now. It'll rain, it'll get some water in it, and then it just goes. But yeah, I just wanted to throw up a map of aquifers in Texas. And I talked about groundwater management areas. And this is, again, this is really important. This is how water is, at least as far as what the development board can fund for developing groundwater, is really based on this. They were created to conserve and protect the groundwater resources in the state of Texas. You can see the different areas right here. Most of you guys are in GMA 8. Yeah. And made up of representatives from the groundwater conservation districts. They're charged with adopting desired future conditions, and those desired future conditions are used to develop modeled available groundwater, which works as a cap for groundwater and regional water planning. The way I like to explain this, and my dad was asking me about this one time, about what all this meant, and I kind of use this to explain it to him, and I've been using it since in different meetings. Think if you have a bucket of water, a 5-gallon bucket of water, and in 50 years you want 2.5 gallons of water left. Well, that's your desired future condition, and you want 50% of the water left in 50 years. Well, you would take that, the groundwater management area would adopt that desired future condition. You would submit that to the Water Development Board. We plug that into the model, so we have a model that really kind of looks at, that models the way that each aquifer acts and reacts. They have an idea, and this is another thing where local knowledge comes into play, because that model takes into account how much water is being drawn out, how many straws are in that bucket of water, how much water is being drawn out. If you don't know how many exactly, or have a good idea of how many straws in that bucket, it really messes up the number that comes out the other end of the model. So they take into account how much water is being withdrawn from the bucket, take into account how much water is drizzling back into the bucket, and that modeled available groundwater represents the amount of water that can be taken out of that bucket every single year and have 2.5 gallons left in 50 years. And so that's basically in a nutshell how adopting desired future conditions, how it comes into play in regional water planning. It develops that number, that amount of water that you can withdraw from an aquifer to reach the desired future condition. And I'm probably speaking to the choir to some of you guys, y'all know this stuff. But I do encourage any folks that are not involved in this process. This is a really important process as well. I mean, it's really important. Groundwater districts, as you know, Middle Trinity Groundwater Conservation District, right, you guys? There's almost 100 groundwater districts in the state. You're seeing more and more of them pop up. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Texas is always historically, rule of capture, locally managed groundwater if there is any management of it. As you see more and more of the larger cities looking to develop groundwater, you see a lot of areas where you're seeing a lot of groundwater development for oil and gas activities. You're starting to see new groundwater districts pop up. But like I said, in the state of Texas, I foresee that as far into the future as I can see, we're gonna look to local management to manage these supplies. Yes, sir.
I gotta say that Mills County doesn't have the box crossing. They no longer have their water conservation, groundwater conservation.
This may be an outdated map. I don't think
Well,
it is.
I mean, they've had it for years and years. It's
Interesting.
talking about that big.
Didn't we hear that they had disbanded?
Maybe they did disband.
They disbanded.
That's shame.
Yeah. No.
In your Willis.
Yeah, maybe they did disband. I wasn't aware of that. But see, and just for example, the High Plains Groundwater Conservation District.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries. Up here, this is actually the oldest groundwater district in Texas. High Plains, Panhandle, and North Plains were the first three in Texas. You've seen more and more. Like I said, every year we're seeing more and more groundwater districts be formed. I actually received a call. This may interest some of you from the Middle Trinity the other day, from a gentleman in Eastland County, asking me what he needed to do to get a groundwater district started, and if they could expand the boundaries of the current groundwater district. And he was referring to y'all as a district, because his actual concern was new production wells have gone in adjacent his property and are drawing down the aquifer, and he's had several of his wells start to have less
Eastland
production.
County was originally in this district,
Okay.
and they opted to drop out.
They opted to drop out?
Yes.
Well, I'd sent him, and like I told him, I was like, I'm not sure how y'all's bylaws are written and if y'all could expand,
We
but
can expand.
I pointed him to y'all's website and gave him,
It's possible, it's up to the board.
yeah, and that's kind of what I figured, but and that's what I told him. I was like, it's, that's the only really and truly, because he was just asking if there's anything from a state, perspective, anything that could help him, and I was like, groundwater is managed locally in Texas. The only real answers, for your problem are, a local developing a new district or seeing if an existing district could expand. But yeah, I think that was last Friday he called me. Real nice gentleman. this is just another map of the Trinity. Unless you guys are familiar with that. As you can see, as you know, and here's a map. Most of you guys in the district have seen this. Maybe some of you haven't. This is basically, if you're looking underground, looking north, this is what the Trinity Aquifer looks like from that standpoint. You know, I think Gatesville's right about here. As you move further west, the Trinity's up around the surface level. It's thinner, and as you move east, it gets thicker and deeper. Like I said, just to give some folks a perspective of what it looks like, and there's multiple formations within the Trinity, especially the further east you get. Just wanted to this particular well, took a picture. This is a well here in Gatesville at Monards Trinity. I believe it's fallen 80 feet over the last 30, 40 years, something like that. Let's see. Yeah, no, from 95 to now, it's fallen about 80 feet. And then, real quick before I finish up, what the Twdb can do now. I've talked a lot about our SWIFT. I've talked a lot about regional planning. I've talked about a little bit about groundwater planning. But we've also, I mentioned early on, one of the reasons we were formed was to act as a bank to fund water projects. So we have several programs out there where we can fund projects. The board has committed over $15 billion worth to projects since we came into being. In the past 2 years, we've committed over $1 billion. And one thing I like to point out, if you look at all the money we've spent, a lot of the money has gone to fund really large projects. But if you look at the number of projects, the actual people coming in and applying for money, over 60% of those were small rural communities. Because as I stated earlier, these small communities are the ones that can really benefit from our programs. I said we fund water projects. Basically, anything that has to do with water, we can fund those projects. We have several programs. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund are federal programs. They have some federal money in them, so they have a little bit more, I guess, what you would consider hoops to jump through. But both of those programs have what we call loan forgiveness or grant money. Depending on the economic situation of the ratepayers in your community, you may actually be eligible for some grant money in some of these programs. The Texas Water Development Fund was the original program that we were given back in 1957. Still goes along kicking. It's funded a lot of good stuff. Rural Water Assistance is specifically to fund projects in rural areas. Economically Distressed Area Program, another one that has loan forgiveness. Some of these, I also should point out the State Revolving Fund programs. We have a really small system proponent to that program, which I forget the number. If it's less than 100 connections, then we can give up to $200,000 in grant money, which basically just give them some money to go, fix leaks, stuff like that. I was working with a gentleman up around Childress the other day, a small system. They have 60 connections and over 160 miles of pipeline. They're losing about 40% of their water, and this is all groundwater up there, it's the Ogallala over there. It recharges, but still not very much. So obviously they're losing a lot of water, half their water. They actually are eligible for that small system, and I think we're going to be able to get them basically the money they need to identify where the leaks are and to fix most of the leaks. Just because they're such a small system, there's no way they could fund that. If they were to go out and, I think their operating budget, he told us their operating budget, they basically take in like $20,000 a year. That's it. So there's no way they could go out and fund this type of stuff on their own. So we do have some money available for really, really small systems. And then depending on the economic situation of your community, we have programs that actually, like I said, have that loan forgiveness or grant money in them.
Just 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
While we're on this,
Mhm.
the funding, there's one issue that has affected Hamilton County and municipalities in Hamilton.
Okay.
And their access to funding, and that has to do with the Water Development Board's requirement that the county not to, previously, then it's my understanding that the municipal entities within the county are no longer available
Yeah.
for these
Some
funds.
some of the programs, and I'm not the expert on all these programs, and I don't think it's all of them, but I'm pretty sure the programs that do have that loan forgiveness, I think EDAP, and I'm pretty sure the state revolving fund programs, I think you're right, they do have to have model subdivision rules have to be in place to be eligible for those fundings. So you're correct, that is,
Without going into down a rabbit trail too far,
uh-huh.
how do we go about getting that requirement changed? Who can I contact?
I'll find out. Make sure,
We don't have any subdivision
uh-huh,
work, never have in
okay.
the county. You know, it may start tomorrow, but I doubt it.
Um,
So it makes no sense for our municipalities to be held hostage, I guess.
Yeah.
To that requirement, and then lose access to all the.
Let me make sure I get your number and email when I leave. But I think Jeff Walker would probably be the guy you need to talk to with our agency. He's a real good guy. He's head over basically all the loan teams. He's a deputy executive administrator, so he would probably be the guy you need to talk to. But let me get your number, and I'll go back and talk to him and find out, and I'll either have him call you, or I'll send you an email saying, yeah, you should call him or call so and so. Because that is, I mean, it's, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking to hear.
Yeah,
You
these
know,
things are important.
Yeah.
I mean, they came to our commissioners court and said, hey, we need your help, and of course, we felt like it was extortion,
Yeah,
from the state's perspective.
yeah,
Trying to get us to, leveraging one local government against another to
Mhm.
implement some kind of a state program.
Yep.
And, so we didn't do it, but yet, it's placed a burden on our,
No, you're exactly right. Because I mean, if it's, if some of those communities are eligible for some of this, some of this free money, that could be a huge benefit to them. You're right, and this is the kind of thing that I'm looking to hear. I want to hear what can we do at the board to make things better, to make sure we're getting water to all the folks out there that need it.
Okay, I'll get you mine.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Doug, it was EDAP, and what was the other one that had some?
The loan for the top two, the state revolving fund programs. So the drinking water state revolving fund, obviously it funds drinking water projects. The clean water funds wastewater projects. I guess they didn't want to call it the wastewater revolving fund, but that's and we get those, we get money. Like I said, there's a little more hoops in those jump through because they have federal money involved in them, like full environmental review, stuff like that. But they do have some loan forgiveness, and I've seen communities that have gotten quite a bit of their loan forgiven. And also keep in mind that some of our projects in SWIFT will be the same way. It's going to be potentially longer repayment terms, also deferred payments until projects are built and you can actually generate some money, generate some revenue off those projects. So that's something that some of our projects, our programs have.
Doug,
Yes, sir.
I'll ask a question, but before I do, I want to tell people online too, this might be a good opportunity if you're still on there to type your questions into the chat window. And my question is in general with some of the EDAP, I guess, and some of the other ones. Do you find yourself being inundated with so many requests you have to be picky, or do you find that you don't have enough people trying to seek funding?
It depends, and it's really, of course, the last several years because of the drought, and you see a lot more folks going out and trying to build new projects. A lot of projects to fix like maybe old, outdated systems where they have pretty high water loss. We're seeing a lot more of that. But generally, so those state revolving fund programs, we solicit applications for those every year. It's on a first come first served basis. We take applications all year round, but if you're one of the first to get your application in, you're gonna have a better shot at free money if you're eligible for it. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Other programs, we're basically all soliciting applications 365 days a year, and most of them. Very rarely are we having to turn people away. Some of the programs, like in the past, we had WIF, which is kind of a precursor to SWIFT, and they would just give us a little bit of money, and we would, for this 2 years, you have this much money, And so we would have to turn people away from that program.
Yep.
But keep in mind, historically, every 2 years the legislature, or whenever we'd run out, the legislature would give us bonding authority. We would go out, issue debt, loan that money out to build projects, pay off the debt. And then when the debt was paid off, then we had to get more bonding authority from the legislature. In 2011, and it went to the vote as well, and it was approved. 2011, we received $6 billion in evergreen bonding authority, which basically means we can have up to $6 billion in debt at any given time, and the evergreen means forever. So we don't have to keep going back to the legislature. And we haven't even touched that yet. We're still finishing up our last bonding authority, and then we'll get into that $6 billion. So we can go out, we can sell bonds, issue debt, loan the money out, and as that payments start coming back in, pay that down, issue more, sell more bonds, issue more debt, and so basically it's just it's a revolving loan program. And the SWIFT is going to work the same way, where that $2 million cash influx that we got from the rainy day fund, we'll be able to use to subsidize the interest rates to make that money more attractive to communities looking to borrow money from us.
Thanks.
There's a question on the screen.
You mentioned water management strategy. Here, I'm reading a question from the screen. You mentioned water management strategies such as creating water diversions or impoundments. Does SWIFT fund such projects for individual ag users? No, we can only loan money to political subdivisions of the state of Texas. But if there's, if you wanted to buy, if you were an irrigator and you wanted to buy a new, more efficient pivot, or if you had a pivot with the spray nozzles up high, you wanted to drop them down to LIPA, you could ask your groundwater district if you're in a area where a groundwater district is, or you could get with somebody. I think counties are eligible for this, and they would have to come and apply for the money, get the money, and then the money would have to be channeled through a political subdivision to get to producers. It's just the way the law's written. The state, we can't just loan money to an individual. But yeah, we could technically fund those types of questions, but that money would have to be channeled through some sort of political subdivision. It could be channeled through a local water provider. It could be channeled through a city, a county, whatever. Hope that answered your question.